write about what we want to write about, and we act the way we are, and we don't pretend. And it's like people won't accept that because they're used to a packaged kind of thing where you have to put on to be accepted. You know, you have to look good on TV, you have to act like you're into it. And sometimes we're not into it and we don't pretend that we are, you know?
Hi everybody, I hope you are doing well. Today we are going to be discussing queer themes in indie rock through the lens of the Minneapolis post-punk band The Replacements, aka the Mats, as they had affectionately dubbed themselves, and their critically acclaimed coming-of-age album, Let It Be. The Replacements were an alternative rock band that first emerged on the Minneapolis late punk scene in the 80s. They formed in 1979 when 19-year-old Bob Stinson, who was learning guitar, decided to force his 11-year-old brother Tommy to play bass in order to keep him out of trouble. The Stinson brothers would soon recruit their drummer, Chris Mars, and the original lineup was complete once they recruited a lead singer, Paul Westerberg, who had been working as a janitor near their practice space at the time. There are many ways that the Replacements have subverted rock and roll with their shows, their marketing, and their typical behavior on stage. They definitely engaged in rock and roll debauchery, but unlike their contemporaries in bands like R.E.M., the Replacements always seemed to have an aversion to commercial success, as well as the phony professionalism of the industry. They were like the Velvet Underground of the 80s, the anti-Rolling Stones, if you will. Now, LGBTQIA representation in indie rock has certainly become more prevalent in recent years with bands like Tegan and Sara, Shoo Shoo, and Perfume Genius. But when we talk about music that is historically affiliated with queerness, indie rock is much lower on the list than more stereotypical genres ascribed to queer culture such as disco, house, pop, and folk. As Jody Taylor writes in Playing It Queer, identifying as lesbian or gay does not necessarily presuppose an affiliation with a particular music scene or subculture. However, there are undeniable musical norms that are associated with mainstream lesbian and gay cultural identity. There is an understanding, albeit a commodified and homogeneous one, that gay music equates to some category of dance music such as house, disco, or pop, while lesbian music usually implies some form of folk music, particularly by female singer-songwriters. This is why I'm interested in examining Let It Be, because the Replacements are a very peculiar case when it comes to rock canon. But what exactly is it that makes them queer? Well, apart from the album directly tackling themes of sexuality and gender identity, with songs like Androgynous, 16 Blue, and even unintentional allusions to queerness with song titles like We're Coming Out, the way the Replacements marketed themselves as a group has always been distinctly queer. Let me explain. The definition of the word queer in terms of sexuality and gender identity is constantly changing and evolving. But apart from the word's affiliation with LGBTQIA umbrellas, the simple definition of the word queer is strange from a conventional viewpoint, something that is outside the perceived norm. The act of queering something means to disrupt the flow of quote-unquote normality in a particular field or space. Subverting expectations is exactly what the Replacements were best at. They queered music spaces with their behavior around industry heads, intentionally sabotaging opportunities to make it big.
The band locked themselves into Sire's conference room. With several producers scheduled to visit, Hill would slip records by the prospective candidates under the door for the band to listen to. The Mats would break the LPs and slip the shattered pieces back to him. Inside, the band rummaged through several storage closets and found a stack of red credit card carbons and began smearing the ink on their faces and the walls. Soon they were blasting songs and rattling around Seymour Stein's vintage Wurlitzer jukebox. A horrified Stein began yelling at Hill, "My jukebox, this is your fault, get them out of here now!"
One of the band's favorite things to do was throw their audience off guard. They often came out on stage wearing dresses, tutus, and skirts, and almost never played live without getting drunk. The only time that they had agreed to film a promotional video was if they made a video that the band members themselves did not appear in. Again, subverting expectations. As stated in the Let It Be deep cut senior video, the Replacements have managed to completely straddle the line between underground and mainstream, garnering enough of an audience during their run, but never fully crossing over into the commercial mainstream. But that hasn't stopped them from being one of the most talked about alternative rock bands in all of music history. A large part of their story is the ways that they rebelled against certain rock and roll cliches. I think Mark Walton put it best. Tension is at the heart of understanding and appreciating the Replacements. Tension between achieving success and the fear of it. Between Westerberg wanting to be in a band and wanting to be true to himself. Between him and Bob, between him and Tommy, between timeless songs and pretty naff songs, and above all, between whether they know just how good they are and only pretend they're messed up. One of music's greatest humble brags, or whether they really do think they're undeserving losers bound for damnation. Let It Be is an album that mixes slow acoustic jams with hardcore thrashers. The album's jangly opener, I Will Dare, is the most indicative of the band's ethos. As lead singer Paul Westerberg said in an interview with Rolling Stone, every song title, if it doesn't apply to the band in some way, we cannot use it. Part of it had to do with the band. We'll dare to flop. We'll dare to do anything. There's really nothing more queer than that. The one thing that queer people know better than anything is being the other, the outcast, being seen as a failure, a flop, because we didn't live up to our surroundings' expectations, be it our parents or our friends. Let It Be gives credence to those growing pains, vulnerability, and specifically references the questioning of one's sexuality on tracks like 16 Blue. This isn't even subtext, this is just in your face written in bold 30-point font. It doesn't even need to be queered, because it already is queer. They even have an entire song dedicated to explorations of gender identity on the album. See no damage, see no evil at all. Cupid dolls and your stars will be laughed at the way you're laughed at now. The emphasis on this shouldn't be undermined. This was an indie rock band from the Midwest, writing songs about young people questioning their gender identity and sexuality in 1984. When I first discovered this album, I was in awe that it had even existed. When you grow up queer and see little to no representation, everything related to queerness from the past that you discover becomes a revelation. When I first heard this album, I was sure that it could have only been written by queer people, because it was way too intimate and personal in the ways that it delved into the struggles of questioning yourself constantly. So it came as a shock when I found out that all 4 members of the Replacements are, unless stated otherwise, probably straight. The ways that Paul Westerberg wrote about struggling with sexuality and gender identity remains a topic of the Replacements that is severely under-discussed in music circles. The hard-pressed heteronormativity and the circumstances of the 80s under the Reagan administration, the Cold War, and the AIDS crisis made it incredibly difficult to live as a young queer person at the time. And the way that the Replacements conducted themselves was inherently queer. That the decade's most astute album about adolescent sexuality came from a pizza maker / drunk, a snot-nosed teenage pot smoker, and a local hard-drinking janitor really should come as no surprise. The idea that middle or upper class people somehow have a better handle on the complexities of sexuality does not really align with historical reality. Take George Chauncey's Gay New York. Working class New Yorkers of all ethnicities and races knew homosexuality well, even if they had yet to articulate its formal meaning. As gay culture took form in 1910, 1920, and 1930s New York, middle and upper class men and women felt it more important to shield their alternative sexuality from public view than their working class counterparts. As Cameron Blevins correctly points out in a brief review of the book, the middle-class, anxious, over-working class sexual practices sought to define heterosexuality more rigidly as a means to protect their own visions of manhood. In this regard, Harlem, a black community, and the immigrant and bohemian-filled Greenwich Village served as sites for some level of public gay culture. Though, as Blevins notes, by the 1920s and 1930s, Harlem nightlife exhibited visibility and vibrancy. The Replacements grasping a sense of this complexity over 70 years later shouldn't be surprising. This is far from the first time that music has been affiliated with queerness. The roots of house music were a club culture that thrived in black queer spaces like the Warehouse in Chicago and the Paradise Garage in downtown New York. And even if rock is lower on the list of expected genres to be associated with queerness, we can't forget that rock and roll was pioneered by people like Little Richard, a black queer man who grew up in a working class family in rural Tennessee. This is absolutely nothing new. The Replacements' transgression of gender and sexual roles was not limited to their songs either. Bob Stinson often wore dresses and tutus on stage. A lot of people treat Stinson's early attire as the butt of a joke or something ironic, but the fact remains that all of this combined with their songwriting, on cuts like I Will Dare, where gender is rarely ever specified, or Androgynous, which narrates the story of a couple transgressing conventional gender roles with the way that they present, you would be hard-pressed not to see a pattern here. In the documentary about the Replacements, Color Me Obsessed, several of the fans who were interviewed share the same sentiment about the Replacements, that they were a band for people who didn't feel a part of things.
Is life worth it? My parents don't understand me. I hate my friends. I don't even know if they like me. What's my purpose in life?
And it does change your life. It makes you feel like, you know what? I'm not what all the kids at school that are cool say I am. I'm not a loser. Like, there are other people that feel the same way, and maybe I am a loser, but I'm the best looking loser ever. And that's Tommy Stinson. That's Paul Westerberg. Those are the guys. We're the coolest losers you're ever gonna meet.
The Replacements, to a degree, embodied that, because you had this, a janitor, a crazy drunk, and a little kid come together in this band, and it was really effective. It was a different slice of that, like, weirdo pie.
That in and of itself is inherently queer. Here's Ryan Raft one more time. So the Replacements, a band that definitely grasped irony, failed to see the irony of a band featuring a male guitarist wearing a dress playing songs with titles like We're Coming Out and Androgynous in Reagan America? Unlikely. And I agree. The fact that a small group of working class indie musicians in the Midwest were making music with heavy queer themes, even if the band members themselves were not queer, should come as no surprise. And as queer music listeners continue to reckon with our history and struggle for more representation, we ought to always remember a great truth that Westerberg invokes in the song Unsatisfied. Everything you dream of is right in front of you, and everything is a lie.